Thank you, Fabian, for that introduction. I appreciate the EPC hosting me today, and I thank you for the work that you're doing and that of Elizabeth Bisland and the rest of your team in putting together this morning's event. Like many diplomatic missions in this town, we at USEU deeply value the work that the EPC does to provide a platform for different perspectives and debate on important current issues. Many topics to discuss today. The first one, and the reason why this is on the wall, is obviously the crisis in the East, in Ukraine. Ukrainian people have acted with remarkable courage and self-restraint in the face of increasingly blatant Russian aggression. Today I want to talk about the US and the EU and how they are cooperating in many countries and across many continents in response to international crises. Ukraine and Iran are just two of these examples of where the relationship between us has evolved into a global partnership. Prior to the wave of democratic transformations that swept through Central and Eastern Europe 25 years ago, Washington's engagement with Europe was almost exclusively with individual states or collectively with NATO. The Lisbon Treaty provided the EU with the tools to be a credible player on the world stage. Secretary of State John Kerry need not repeat Kissinger's famous statement about who to call in Europe. He knows Cathy Ashton's phone number and values her perspective. They have frequently collaborated on a host of global issues that previously lay outside the trade and economic focus of the US-EU relationship. We look forward to continuing that relationship with Foreign Minister Federica Mogherini, and we also look forward to continuing with Prime Minister Tusk the excellent relations we've enjoyed with President Van Rompuy, and we congratulate both of them sincerely and wish them well at this historic moment. A glance at the US-EU Summit statement from March of this year reveals a full agenda. Less than a third of it is related to the traditional suite of economic and trade and development issues. Most of it focuses on foreign policy and security matters of mutual concern. I expect that the European Union's role in global affairs will continue to grow, and with it, the US-EU global partnership. Therefore, this morning I will focus on this partnership and above all concerning the Ukraine before going on to address several priorities in the bilateral transatlantic relationship, which will remain important. When I began my job at the National Security Council during President Clinton's first administration, I declared that I wanted to focus on EU affairs. And the reaction I got when I started the first day was, "That's wonderful, because no one else in this building cares about that stuff." But that's changed, obviously. No one would say that today. My interest reflected the fact that I had served as a stagiaire in the European Commission and subsequently as an antitrust lawyer here in Brussels. No one else was interested in that focus because at the time the NSC was largely concerned with issues of hard power, specifically in dealing with the conflict in Bosnia. In my time at the NSC, my friend and mentor, Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, was our ambassador to the EU. Together we pushed for the conclusion of the new transatlantic agenda signed in December 1995. That document helped to shift the perception in Washington that the EU was not as effective a partner as individual member states on foreign policy issues. The focus of that new foreign policy cooperation was primarily on increasing peace, democracy, and stability in Central and Eastern Europe and the states of the former Soviet Union, but it also specifically included the Middle East, human rights, non-proliferation, and development and humanitarian assistance. Moreover, the agenda called for the US-EU relationship to move from joint consultation to joint action in a number of areas. And those steps serve to promote President Kennedy's vision of a transatlantic partnership of equals. Since the signing of that agenda 20 years ago, there has been a growing appreciation of the importance of soft power, of the impact of the EU's domestic policies on US interests, and of the growing potential to collaborate on shared foreign policy concerns. This is reflected, among other things, in the fact that our staff at the USEU mission comes from a wide cross-section of the U.S. government. While the breadth of the USEU partnership is constantly growing, some of the issues still remain priorities for us. Ukraine and Russia, important concerns in 1990, topped the agenda at the USEU summit in March of this year, as well as at the G7 summit hosted by the European Council 2 months later. Today, we face a serious crisis in Ukraine. And it's worth reminding ourselves that it all started with Russia's refusal, which continues to this day, to allow the Ukrainian people to choose their own destiny, including a free trade agreement with the European Union. Remarkable. The EU and the United States are standing up for the principle of territorial integrity, the rejection of changes of borders through the use of force, and respect for international law. Russia's actions represent a fundamental challenge to our shared values and the rules-based international order. They require a steadfast response and a willingness to bear the costs. Sometimes a picture can be worth 1,000 words. That's why that cartoon is behind me. In March of this year, The Economist published an article entitled "Putin's Arrow: The crisis in Ukraine is reinvigorating transatlantic ties." The cartoon, as you can see, maybe some of you have a hard time seeing the details, features Putin as a Cupid, bare-chested, wearing army fatigues, just after firing an arrow at a tree where someone is carved in a heart-shaped form, the initials of the US and the EU. In the distance, President Obama and a woman dressed in the EU flag are happily walking off into the distance. Now, I'm not revealing any state secrets when I say that when I arrived in March of this year, US-EU relations were, how shall we say, in a difficult phase, in large part due to Snowden allegations and concerns about data privacy. As the Economist article argued, quote, "Russia is reminding both sides of the ties that bind." At a time when Russia is supplying troops and equipment, including tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, multiple rocket launchers to the separatists in the Ukraine, and bears responsibility for the slaughter of European citizens over the skies of Ukraine, it would be appropriate to put peripheral issues which are attracting significant media attention, such as chicken washed in chlorine, into some perspective. Russia's actions may remind us again of the geostrategic and economic importance of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement. And Russia's actions may also assist in wrapping up several negotiations underway related to data privacy. I'll refer to both TTIP and data privacy in just a moment. European integration and transatlantic cooperation have always been forged in moments of crisis, specifically at times of external threat. Over the last few months, I've had the opportunity to be in that beautiful Justus Lipsius building, where on the ground floor one can see photographs of the founding fathers of the EU, Jean Monnet, Walter Hallstein, Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and others. One person who played a key role in the creation of the European coal and steel community, the kernel of what was later to become the European economic communities, is not on the wall. Joseph Stalin. The Soviet threat accelerated Europe's integration and was an important reason for strong US support for that process. Now, I'm not suggesting we are back to the days of the Cold War. However, Vladimir Putin may unwittingly be acting as the midwife of a new era in European integration and transatlantic cooperation. For now, Putin basks in the glow of high popular approval due to his nearly total control of the Russian media, banging the nationalist drum and engaging in Soviet-style agitprop bring short-term dividends. But it's safe to say that Putin has done more than any other Russian leader to set back Russia's strategic interests. Consider the following. Russian actions accelerated the timetable for Ukraine's signature of its deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and alienated the vast majority of the Ukrainian population, which for historical and cultural reasons had every reason to desire strong relations with its eastern neighbor. They accelerated the signature of EU association agreements with Moldova and Georgia. They led the U.S. to deploy paratroopers in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, led our NATO partners to send fighter jets to Estonia and Poland. They resulted in NATO conducting air policing operations over the Baltic states and increased military exercises and training in Eastern Europe. The NATO summit may decide to pre-position troops in Poland and the Baltics. European defense spending, which has been on a downward trajectory for years, may stabilize and perhaps even reverse. And some neutral countries are re-examining their potential membership in NATO. Today, nobody would question the relevance of NATO. A few years ago, many were. All of this thanks to Mr. Putin. Perhaps most importantly, Russian actions, including the shutoff of gas to Ukraine, have focused minds on Russia's unreliability as an energy exporter and on the importance of an EU energy policy. Such a policy would include diversification of supply, the creation of a true internal market where energy can flow more freely, and the ability of Europe to negotiate as one in order to resist Russian efforts to use energy as a political weapon against the weak. At the same time, Russia is vigorously opposing fracking. It does so out of concern to protect the health of European citizens. That's about as likely as the claim that several thousand Russian soldiers lost their bearings and mistakenly crossed into Ukraine over the past several weeks. We have been busy following up on the recommendations of the USEU Energy Ministerial in Brussels last spring regarding measures to enhance energy security in Ukraine. Some medium to long-term measures which could avoid Russian territory were also discussed. There are many ways in which the US and the EU can collaborate on energy security. These may include LNG exports from the United States, the mobilization of private capital to build the necessary infrastructure in Europe, collaboration on enhancing the transparency of Ukraine's energy sector, assisting Ukraine to develop national hydrocarbon resources, and sharing experiences in the development of alternative energies. I've been a front row observer of how the Ukraine crisis is strengthening the sinews of transatlantic cooperation every day. The U.S. government and the Commission, Council, and the member states are coordinating financial assistance bilaterally and through the international financial institutions, focusing aid programs where they are most needed, and working together to help Ukraine begin to address its energy needs. Our coordination on Russia sanctions has been close and productive, just as it was on Iran sanctions. The last package, announced in late July, was a significant step forward. I've been impressed that 28 member states have been able to take significant actions, notwithstanding different perspectives and different vulnerabilities. President Herman Van Rompuy made clear at last week's meeting of the European Council that the European Council is ready to take significant steps and has requested the Commission to urgently undertake preparatory work together with the Action Service to present proposals within a week, by the end of this week, including provisions on the basis of which every person and institution dealing with the separatist groups in the Donbass will be listed. This week we are discussing concrete proposals with European counterparts regarding the tightening of existing sanctions and the implementation of new ones with teeth. As you may have seen, France has now announced the suspension of the Mistral sale. It was the right decision, it was a principled decision, and we support it. We welcome the fact that Donald Tusk will play a critical role in guiding the work of the 28 member states meeting on this issue in the European Council going forward. His courage, his moral compass, demonstrated ever since his solidarity activism, combating authoritarian rule, are critical assets at this time. I had the opportunity to witness the courage of those activists when I studied at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow in 1983, and I got to meet many of those people. Now, while Ukraine is the critical focus of USEU collaboration relating to third countries, it certainly isn't the only one. In Iran, High Representative Ashton has shown remarkable leadership in the P5+1 talks, as we call them, the E3+3 in EU parlance. The United States remains committed to working with our P5+1 partners towards a long-term comprehensive solution that provides confidence that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively peaceful. An initial step was taken with an interim joint plan of action which provided limited relief from certain sanctions in exchange for Iranian steps that halted its nuclear program and rolled it back in key respects. The relief agreed was limited outside of the specific areas provided for in the joint plan of action. U.S. sanctions remain in place and we continue to enforce them, an essential part of our dual-track policy to continue to maintain pressure on Iran in order to achieve a successful outcome in the negotiations over its nuclear program. And pursuant to that policy, the Departments of Treasury and State imposed sanctions on several companies and individuals engaged in activities such as assistance to Iran's nuclear program, support for terrorism, or aiding Iran's evasion of international sanctions. Iran's experience under the Joint Plan of Action has reinforced its knowledge that real economic relief can only come if it obtains comprehensive sanctions relief, and that can only come about if it is prepared to enter into a comprehensive plan of action that ensures that Iran cannot acquire a nuclear weapon and that its nuclear program is exclusively peaceful. There are other issues as well on which we're engaged with the EU. I won't mention them all, but I'll just mention quickly countering violent extremism, which is obviously a topic that is very relevant in our television screens almost every day. The issue of foreign terrorist fighters who travel to and from Syria has been a top issue of concern for the United States and for the EU. Conclusions reached through ministerial meetings among a number of European member states, known commonly as the EU9, and which were held on the margins of Council Justice and Home Affairs meetings, will be discussed for the first time between the European Council and the United States at the September 18th European Union United States Justice and Home Affairs senior officials meeting in Rome. High-level experts from the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and Department of State are scheduled to attend that meeting. The United States is particularly focused on building a common EU passenger name record system and in increasing the effectiveness of sharing information collected through a European PNR, passenger name record system, with U.S. border security officials in order to prevent acts of terrorism by foreign terrorist fighters. Cybersecurity is an important topic, but I want to get to the bilateral agenda because we have two still very important issues that I'm working on. Namely, data privacy and TTIP. Shortly after I arrived, I announced those were two of my four key priorities. First one, data privacy is still and remains one of the most critical issues today affecting US-EU relations. Why? Because it has major implications for the way we cooperate on law enforcement, the ability of companies to do business across the Atlantic, and so much more. World crises, as well as progress toward alleviating European concerns on this issue, have lowered the profile of the issue over the past year. However, I have no doubt that if we fail to put these concerns behind us, they could return to complicate US-EU relations. And that is why I have focused intently, consistent with the US-EU Summit Declaration, on making progress on the negotiations underway with regard to the so-called Safe Harbor Framework and the so-called Umbrella Agreement for data exchanges in the field of police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters, including terrorism. The Safe Harbor Framework was developed, as many of you may know, to provide a mechanism allowing US-based companies to receive EU citizens' data in a manner consistent with the EU Data Protection Directive. The framework has proven to be of critical importance to ensuring transatlantic data flows, which is the lifeblood of transatlantic commerce. Over 3,000 companies certify their data privacy policies under this framework. Last November, the Commission outlined 13 recommendations for strengthening Safe Harbor. We have since embarked on discussions with the Commission on potential updates to that framework, making good progress in 11 commercially focused recommendations, and we're now focused on 2 of the recommendations, 12 and 13, related to the national security exemption, of which perhaps some of you have read. While these are clearly the most challenging, we are planning on submitting a detailed description of how U.S. laws and policies restrict the application of such an exemption in order to provide comfort that it is narrowly construed. Talks on the umbrella agreement, which is for law enforcement, are well advanced, and we're working hard to resolve the remaining issues. We share the EU's commitment to privacy and are responding to EU concerns and questions about how we protect personal data. In addition to changing the principles that govern what we do and what we don't do abroad in surveillance, President Obama called for the extension of additional protections to the personal data of non-US citizens, a key request of some of our European partners. He is committed to seeking passage by the US Congress of legislation giving EU citizens the same rights to judicial redress that the US Privacy Act gives to American citizens. That is a significant step forward, and I'm pleased to say that the USEU mission played a key role in making that declaration. We're not finished yet. We need to draft that legislation. It's almost done. We need to present it before Congress, and it needs to be passed. And we're going to need the help of businesses to get it passed. And so many of you may be called upon to help us in that regard. TTIP is the second priority I mentioned. It reflects the fact that it is a priority, reflects the huge benefits that a transatlantic deal could bring. A comprehensive, ambitious agreement that eliminates tariffs and reduces behind-the-border non-tariff barriers would create growth and jobs. TTIP is simply the best debt-free stimulus available. Not the only one. We think of the digital agenda. We can think of reforming labor markets. We can think of many other things. But it is one, surely, of the most important ways that Europe can stimulate growth and jobs. And we certainly know that Europe needs to stimulate growth and jobs. It would also be of geostrategic importance because it would set a standard for future regional and global deals that reflect the value we place on rules-based trade, high standards, and regulatory transparency and accountability. It would enhance the US-EU partnership in the realm of trade negotiations, helping to make progress in the stalled WTO talks, and ensuring that world trade rules will continue to be compatible with free market democratic systems. The 7th round of negotiations will take place in Washington later this month. We are making steady progress in all the working groups. Some of it's not public because a lot of this work is very technical and very granular. But important technical work has occurred that clarifies the respective positions, and we have tabled offers and tariffs and on services and have consolidated texts now in several areas. Unfortunately, the debate in Europe is increasingly being marred by a rising tide in certain member states of misinformation and what I would even call scaremongering by certain social media, press, and NGOs. While everyone is certainly entitled to his own interpretation of what we're trying to achieve, everyone should not be entitled to his own facts. And I said that yesterday in my appearance before the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, which is going to play a critical role, obviously, in determining whether this agreement gets over the line. In that testimony, I set forth several propositions. First, leaders should have the courage to lead and to inform, not simply cater to prevailing opinions when these are misinformed. Second, the myriad of technical issues in the negotiation should be considered in the wider perspective of the economic gains to be gained and the geostrategic context in which we are negotiating. Third, both sides should seek to advance pragmatic solutions to their disagreements and avoid rhetoric that complicates the negotiations. I can give you a few examples of that on both sides. Fourth, critics who remain deeply skeptical of what we're trying to achieve should at least wait until they see advanced text before making up their minds. Let me just conclude here. Returning to the cartoon, Russia is demonstrating at this time a cynical disdain for the ability of the United States and the EU to remain united and take meaningful actions over the duration of this crisis. Every time we talk about a peaceful resolution, Putin engages in more provocation. While he was in Minsk, he was also busy increasing Russia's military presence in Ukraine. Recently, he has repeated his references to Novorossiya and to statehood for East Ukraine. He has said, not denied, although they said it was taken out of context, that he can take Kiev in 2 weeks. I would like to see the context that makes that statement less objectionable. We can live up to this challenge, just as we can respond to the challenges of Iran, just as we can respond to the challenges of foreign fighters and cybersecurity. Our ability to do so would be enhanced if the United Kingdom remains an active, engaged member of the EU, which it has been. We have very close relations with the UK, and as we've stated before on many occasions, we look forward to the UK remaining an active and engaged member of the EU. I believe that the US-EU relationship will continue to broaden and to deepen. That's not an article of faith, but our shared values are real. In the more dangerous, less predictable world in which we live, our mutual interests demand a robust global partnership. All I can say is I'll try to do my part in helping its continued development. Thanks very much.